Hi. Today, as I mentioned before, I think in one of the updates, we're going to be talking about the different versions of Mykeria. The original version that I've shown you was the first finished one, the first completed one. There were some older prototypes from before that, but I didn't really keep them around, so I won't be showing them to you. However, during the last 2 years, over the last 2 years, there were two other versions of the game, which I would like to present to you today. Both were commissioned by a publisher who was thinking about publishing the game, and the changes were made because they thought like the basic game was a bit too basic. It was a bit too simple for their taste, there was not enough variety in the cards, and so I started tinkering. The first version that I would like to show you is pretty much something that might make an expansion to the game if an expansion is ever made. And this is the very same basic game, but with several new, more powerful cards, with a fifth god, and with an added mechanic of temples and chapels, or chapels and temples. So the character that I added was called Yish, and she was a goddess of the elements. Her cards were actually quite varied. They had all kinds of different options. Some of them were used to attack other players, others were used to increase faith, and then there were a few cards which allowed her to create these things, which are Britannia tokens. As Britannia is one of those games where I really don't see any other way of using the game than a token supply. About these tokens, there were two types. There we go. This is a chapel, which was this small building, and then we've got a temple. You could have a chapel, you could build a chapel, and then you could upgrade it to a temple if you wished. The cards always allowed you to do one or the other. I mean, you could, if you played a card when you didn't have a chapel, you could build a chapel. If you played a card when you had a chapel, you can either build another one or upgrade the chapel to a temple, which was usually the better thing to do. And chapels and temples acted as bonuses. Each of these buildings added a bonus to the amount of cult points you got every turn. And it depended on, I think, if you had a certain amount of followers. You had to have some sort of minimal follower number to build those. Can't remember the exact number right now. Of course, this also influenced the god cards of other gods, and I've added some abilities for creating those chapels and those temples. And to be honest, that's pretty much it, other than decreasing the amount of the cult points, which I also did with the new prototype that you guys got. And I did decrease some of the points, got rid of that silly rule, which I talked about last week. And so that was pretty much it. We've tested it out. I was quite happy with the changes because I was already thinking about expanding the basic game years ago. Uh, since the game was completed, I already had an idea for a few new gods, maybe a new mechanic here or there. But the publisher didn't think that was enough, and they wanted some more changes. And those changes came with a change of theme. Mykeria was to become a game set in a cyberpunk theme, which I found to be a weird decision, but on the other hand, I was quite happy with it because I'm a big fan of the theme. I'm a big fan of cyberpunk. So the changes that I made to the second prototype were much bigger. I'm going to show you the examples of that stuff in a minute, but first a few words of introduction. The game was about several hackers attacking the same corporation in a concerted offensive move so that the corporation cannot really sufficiently defend itself from the hackers. And that was only a thematic exposition bit, an explanation for what you were doing. There was no cooperative mm, gameplay in that game, but the plot basically told you that you were working together, and the basic mechanics stayed the same. You had cards, you played those cards to do certain stuff, to get links instead of followers, links to the corporation's database. And the idea was expanded to include some new, smaller mechanics. And about those mechanics, I'll tell you right now. This is how the prototype looked like when I was testing it. And as you can see, I've gone very much into the way of cyberpunk with how these boards are arranged. And you can already see the resemblance to the Mykeria prototype that you've received and the one that I've been showcasing. Especially on this board here, which is the player's board. You have the same free spaces for your links in this game. In this game you'd create links to a database instead of gathering followers, but there were free levels of those as well. Over here, then you've got a 5th turn space for your cards, so the same mechanic was there. Then you've got a space for your god cards, which here were your specific hacker cards. Here's the way the points were counted. So these elements are very familiar, but everything else probably isn't. And I'll just explain what the other elements were. Over here you had the files, and files, pictured over here, were these sort of special cards that you could get. And when you got those special cards, they each had some kind of condition which told you what you have to do to gain additional points. And in this case, for example, let's find something that isn't overpowered. The balance of these cards was quite a pain in the ass to get right. For example, here you've got one which says that you have to have 3 keys and at least 2 of them have to be blue. And if you had that, you could play this card and get those 9 points. That was an additional way of gaining points as you encoded files. Or decoded, rather, files. This space over here and this space over here was used for the keys. Keys were represented by these small cubes, and how this worked was that with each card that you play, this is the deck of the common cards, by the way, this over here. So with each card you played, you had a key shown over here, and you'd get that key when you play that card. So if I play this card, I get the green key. Keys were sort of the codes or the passwords that you uncovered while rummaging through the system, and you could use those to your advantage. And the way you do that is with every other card you had a special condition which told you what kind of key you can play to gain access to that special condition. So in this case, if I have the green key, I could play this card next and spend the green key, and that would allow me to get an additional follower, in this case an additional link. The idea behind this whole system was that I wanted to give the players a reason to play the cards in a specific order. They would look at their hand and they would say, okay, I could play this right now, but if I play this as my next move, I'm going to be able to make it a stronger card. And also you had your specific cards. As you can see, all of them had 3 keys, and that meant that you'd have to expend 3 keys, but you would get a very powerful update to that ability. So it was a case of, do you want to save up for buffing your special card, or do you want to just spend it as you go if you need them on the common cards? That was the main change in the game, which I think worked very well, and I'm very open to revisiting that mechanic at some point. This place on the board, and to be entirely honest, I can't for the life of me remember what this was for. Yeah, they were secure links. There were some cards that allowed you to change some of your links to secure links, and those links would be worth, I believe, 2 points maybe, but they could never be upgraded. So they were always here. Nobody could ever do anything with them, but they didn't give you as many points potentially, and they didn't really count towards the majorities over here, which also I kept from the original prototype. Okay, with that said, here's the main board, and in the main board you can see again a few things that should be quite familiar. So you've got the active links pool and the destroyed links pool. You've got here over here, there we go, how many turns the game takes. And here's the place where you'd put the common cards deck. Here's the place for the keys. This is the discard for the common cards, and this was a mechanic that was in the prototype for a short while, but then I got rid of it. And those were alarms. As you can see, all those cards, the specific cards and the common cards, have this small alarm symbol here and a value. The idea was that whenever you played a card, you would advance the alarm, and the card which would be over here face up would tell you how many points of the alarm have to be gathered for the alarm to take place. And when that happened, players would be hit with something nasty, like losing links or losing cards or that sort of stuff. And the idea was that this is something of a run-up mechanism, because the leader would always get the most damage. Players thought, and they thought rightly, that this was sort of unfair for the leader. That's one thing. And the other thing was that it really made the game a bit slower, because you'd lose resources. And as I said when I was talking about Boguhar last episode, losing resources in Mykeria is sort of a pain, and you really don't want to do that. Even if it happens to everyone, you still feel like it does too much damage, which is why alarms were gone from the game. Not to mention that they were very hard to keep track of, and players usually forgot about advancing the track. So that was a reason for just throwing them out. Okay, so that's it for this presentation of the Mykeria Hackers prototype, which was dubbed at one point Operation Icarus Fall, which was sort of a silly name, but I had to think of something. And to be entirely honest, this idea still lives somewhere in the back of my head, and I would really love to create a game like this, but perhaps not with Mykeria mechanics. Perhaps the keys I would leave in, definitely, because I really like that mechanic, but I would try to do them in sort of a different way. And who knows, maybe someday I'll create that game. As I mentioned in the very first video about Mykeria, the project was dropped by the publisher, which is quite a shame, because I've spent around 2 years talking to them and making all the changes they wanted to. But I see the option for creating something more out of Mykeria. So if you're of the mind that the current prototype is too little, basically, is not that there's not enough content there, let me know, because if that's the case, we can figure out how to expand the game, either in the first way, in the first method, that is just adding new cards, adding new options, adding maybe several new gods, and that sort of stuff. So within the mechanics that I've already presented to you, or maybe it is time that Mykeria made the plunge towards something a bit more complex with a few more mechanics. Who knows? In my opinion, the game works as is, but it is also starting to show its age. So if, at least in my opinion, you know, I saw the game so many times, being played so many times, that I really cannot have the distance needed to review it properly nowadays. So I'll be very happy to receive any thoughts you have on the prototype, and if you found any of the changes that I've mentioned in this video interesting, tell me about that as well. Until next time, and I hope you're having as much fun watching these videos as I have recording them. See you around.